All right, how guys doing today? About to comment to a little reaction of first things first. I just want to make sure y'all like that video up. You know what to do. Exit full screen, scroll just a little bit, like it up, then full screen it back up. You feel me? All right, so the video today coming from the boy Cold Case Christianity, Mr. Jay Warner and Jimmy Wallace. You already know them because we've seen them before. We got how Noah and the flood proved Christianity. Now, my rudimentary thinking on the subject is that sin had to be purged once before at the cost of blood. So this was that first, and now we have a different way through Jesus Christ. I don't know if he's going to talk about prove it as in like it happened so it proves that the rest is true, or how the story, i.e. the literal foundation of the story, proves it. Because right, we can go back to Cain and Abel and how it's like vegetables weren't sufficient, but the blood of something was sufficient, and Jesus was the blood to appease God as the sacrifice, and bloody bloody bloop blop, you get it. Anyway, let's cut it up. Let's see what it's talking about.
Now, let's get talking about this very controversial issue, because you know the scripture and the kind of craziness of the miraculous supernatural Old Testament has caused skeptics to scratch their head and make statements for many generations. So when you go back in time to someone like Samuel Butler and read this statement, the Bible may be the truth, but it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. You can see I might be one to accept certain aspects of the Old Testament, certain aspects of the Genesis account, but the flood, really? That one I think I can leave out, because there may be some truth in there, but that can't be true. Or what Mark Twain says here when he says the Bible has noble poetry in it, and some clever fables, and some blood-drenched history, and a wealth of obscenity, and upward of 1,000 lies. That's confidence building, don't you think? As a Christian, to hear that our hero here, Mark Twain, was so adamantly against the scripture. But even in our generation, the generation that our young people is exposed to, with the kind of new atheism that they're exposed to from authors in this culture, don't think for a second that they're not getting it full force and much more aggressive than this. Let's take a look at what some of the people are saying today. Someone like Richard Dawkins, probably one of the most well-known atheists in the world today. I'm sorry to take a sledgehammer to so small and fragile a nut, but I have to do so because more than 40% of the American people believe literally in the story of Noah's Ark. We should be able to ignore them and get on with our science, but we can't afford to because they control the school boards. They homeschool their children to deprive them of access to proper science teachers, and they include many members of the United States Congress, some state governors, and even presidential and vice presidential candidates. The problem isn't just that you silly people believe in fables. It's that you silly people are sometimes in control. And that's why folks like this are no longer benign about their aggressive denial, their aggressive opposition to Christianity. Is that it's actually creating a world that they think is dangerous. A world in which religious fundamentalists like us will fly planes into buildings. So they want to address this kind of thing in their writings, and boy, are we seeing a lot of that now. And when it comes to the issue of the flood story, do you think they really have to do much convincing to a young audience in secular universities that this story is such a joke? This is such a fable? They don't spend a lot of time arguing scientifically why it's a fable. All they typically do is just describe the story. You know, that a flood, the globe was covered, every piece of land.
I will say, on the majority, they don't point to why it's scientifically, a fable or whatever, but you can go check out my video before. I forget the name of the guy's channel. I think it was Holy Kool-Aid who made the video, and I don't remember the title of his video, but mine was titled like Noah's flood was impossible, question mark, open parentheses, reaction, close parentheses. And in that, he described a lot of scientific reasons why Noah's flood was impossible. And people in the comments was getting all worked up with me, talking about you didn't even say anything about his points and just said that they were wrong or whatever. It's because I don't know anything about his points, right? These are all new claims that I had never heard before. Why am I just going to get on here and say a bunch of things that I ain't never heard before? Or say a bunch about some things I never heard before. I have no basis on these things. I haven't read the research papers. I bet them people ain't even read the research papers, and yet they want me on here to give my 1,000% truth. Like, relax. I'm just sitting here reacting. They're like, you ain't talking enough, and it's like, I never heard half this stuff. Like he just said, people usually don't argue scientifically about the thing. But a lot of the claims, they seem to be true on the surface. Like, I could believe them that they were true. Now, with this, their involvement with the flood and the story and the truth of that, who knows? But anyway, let's let Mr. Cook again.
Land was covered with water, really? How much water would that be? And that every single thing on the earth was destroyed? every human was destroyed by this flood, really? Except for some small group, a family who survived. And oh, what about the animals? Oh yeah, they're all destroyed too. Except, they got pairs of the different species on the boat. Really? All of them? Oh yeah, all of them. Oh, and they got on a boat and they survived this in the water. Yeah. How does that sound to you? Does that sound reasonable to you? There are times when the skeptics will get in front of debates, like when I saw Christopher Hitchens debate William Lane Craig at Biola several years ago when Hitchens was still alive. And he simply had to discredit his opponent like he typically does. He'll ask the audience, look at the audience, look at his opponent, and demonstrate the ridiculous nature of his opponent by asking a simple question. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Yes, I do. I rest my case. Do you believe in the flood of Noah? Yes, I do. I rest my case. You're ridiculous. So I think it is important for us to meet the challenge, don't you? Is this a piece of history? Or is Mark actually asking us in the series he's preaching, there's some good stories we can learn in Genesis and some good stories we can learn from the flood story. Sure, it's fable. It's like Dr. Seuss, but Dr. Seuss teaches good things too. But rather than use Dr. Seuss this morning, we'll use the account in Moses. I don't think that's what he's trying to get us to do. I think he actually wants us to read the text the way that Moses wrote it. Moses wrote it as history. He wrote it as a history in which people preceded Noah and people followed Noah. Noah's in a chronology of people who really lived. So let's take a look at it and see if we can actually make any sense of it from that perspective, not as though it's some convenient, usable delusion. It's kind of like the thing we do when we have any set of witnesses. Someone's going to tell me a story about the crime, and I've got to figure out, why should I trust this guy? Why should I trust her? I had a murder that occurred in 1981 in our city in this house. And this murder was of a high school girl, a junior, who was stabbed to death. And it was a tragic event. And many years went by before we reopened the case. And by the time we reopened the case, we started to talk to the people who knew her or knew something about the murder or lived next door to her or worked with her, people in her sphere of influence. And we asked them questions about what happened that day and what they knew about it. And while all their stories had common features, they all knew that she had been murdered in her house after walking up the street with somebody she didn't know who she let in the house. Those are all common features, which is why, young ladies, you never let anybody in your house, right? This is what parents always worry about. This is like a parent's worst nightmare. But when you talk to people about how she was killed, her friends would sometimes contextualize their memory of what occurred or what they really thought had occurred, and they only got some of the features correct. So for example, you might ask, well, how was she killed? One person told me that she was convinced she was killed by somebody from school, her high school where she attended. Another person told me, no, actually it was a coworker at the pizza joint down the street where she used to work named Jason. Another person told me, no, actually it was this crazy neighbor like 3 doors down who lived next to us for years, and I knew that boy was crazy, and he's who killed her. What they were doing was kind of contextualizing the event in their own memory. Yeah, she did work with somebody named Jason, and the other coworker they shared always suspected Jason was the killer. And so now 25 years later, tell me about it. Oh, we had a coworker named Jason. That's the guy who did it. It wasn't really the guy who did it, but you see what she's doing? She's taking her own experiences and she's adding a feature. We know one thing for sure. Somebody did follow her up that street, walk with her, get in her house, spend some time with her, and then kill her. That we know. And while these other details change because each person's contextualizing, one person thought she was strangled for sure. That's what she heard from her friends. Another person thought she was murdered with a hatchet. Pretty wide range of ways of dying, huh? All the common features were there, but the variations were different based on the contextualization of each person. I think something similar is probably happening with the flood story. We see a large overlap in terms of what the basic features are of the event, the same way I did here, but each person telling it borrows some character from their own context and inserts that character. It's not Noah, it's somebody else. It's Gilgamesh, or it's Uruk, or it's some other Akkadian character from a prior mythology, whoever it may be. They insert and contextualize what they want to bring to the account. Does that make sense? What I have to figure out is, when talking to these people, how much of this is their own insertion, and what's the core truth I can mine out that I can trust. And that's what we're doing with this account from Noah. We're trying to find what is the core truth. Because we'd like to think that the only truth that's out there is the version of Moses. But as I said, there are other versions. We've got 3 ancient versions of a flood account. 3. One is found right here in Genesis, the flood of Noah. But it isn't the only ancient account of a flood. There are 2 more. One is found in this tablet, which is the ancient account of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is found in tablet 11. Now, Gilgamesh there are several versions of this story that have been found in different archaeological sites. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's another ancient version of the story.
Real quick about Gilgamesh, we had to read that for one of my classes that I took 2 semesters ago. And the thing about this one, I'm pretty sure if my mind is serving correctly, it doesn't actually go into the story of the flood account. The story features a character named Gilgamesh, and that character has to go on these trials and all these things to see the person that experienced the flood and save the animals 2 by 2. The same type of deal as Noah. However, it doesn't go into depth about the story the same way that, Moses tells the story of Noah. It's more so Gilgamesh is on his own journey and has to go see this guy, talks with him briefly about the fact that there was the flood, and all that. And the flood, you know, is kind of the same thing. Worldwide flood, 2x2 of animals. That's what I remember. But the guy himself, I forget his name, he lived on this secluded little island through this there's a huge tunnel guarded by like these flying scorpion dudes or something, and Gilgamesh had to go in through the tunnel, eventually find this like island. I think it was surrounded by a bunch of vortexes of water, I don't know, but he lived on that island. He was granted immortality. That's all I know. I think he had a wife, but the wife died, or the wife was there and fed Gilgamesh. I don't really remember the specifics, but it doesn't necessarily go into the whole flood story. It's just a brief touching point on Gilgamesh. The flood story was probably recorded in some tablets elsewhere, but Gilgamesh, they're currently still looking for tablets to finish the story because it's an incomplete story, because it's that old and that antiquated. Is that they're still finding tablets, they're still trying to translate. They had to translate that into English from whatever that, they had to figure out what that language was and then translate it into English, which is crazy. It's a Babylonian cuneiform, if you wanted to know. So anyway, back to the video.
Story, there's the flood of Atrahasis, found in an epic that precedes Gilgamesh. In fact, people think that Gilgamesh's text borrows from Atrahasis. So the question, of course, is which of these should I trust? Let me put them in a timeline. If I was to draw a timeline, and at one end of the timeline I put today, and at the beginning of the timeline I put way back when, okay? Now, if I look at where these stories appear, you're going to discover that the European stories are not as ancient as the ones around the Mediterranean. And the stories in the Americas are actually not as ancient as the stories in Europe. In other words, it looks like the stories are following people as they migrate across the globe. So my question is going to be, well, where do these stories come from? That's probably the story I can trust, right? Well, there is an ancient version that Moses writes in 1400 BC. There it is. The problem, of course, is that there are other ancient versions. Now, Gilgamesh, actually, the copy we have that actually includes the best flood narrative comes from about 1000 to 1300. But the problem is that most scholars see that the insertion about the flood actually comes from the epic of Atrahasis, which occurs prior. That's a much older copy. 1625 is a lot older than 1400. So why should I believe that Moses' copy in 1400 is the source? It's clearly not the earliest. How do I know that Moses isn't just repeating some mythology that he heard before him? Well, it turns out that no one on the wall is describing an event that they actually saw. And by the way, either is the author of the Akkadian version. They're not describing something they saw firsthand. They're all describing an event that occurred prior to them. Does that make sense? So really the question isn't about whether, in order to figure out this out, I got to figure out which of these early versions should I trust. That's really what this comes down to. I know I had a murder in 1981. I know it had certain characteristics. The question is, which witness afterwards should I trust, right? Same thing. I know I've got an early event. I've got 3 people describing it. Which one should I trust? Make sense?
To be honest, that was a horrible stopping point for the video. But to his point of which one should you trust, I will say the Gilgamesh one followed the story of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh so happened to run into the guy who experienced the flood. It wasn't told from the narrative of the guy who experienced the flood. However, Moses's, right, Noah's story, it is told sequentially with the whole Genesis account, right? Goes from Adam and Eve to boop-de boop-de boop boop. Noah's here, boop-de boop-de boop. We keep on going till we get to Isaac and Jacob and all them. And that makes me believe in it, because it's like, well, we're telling it in the order of a sequential story. If you don't believe the whole rest of the story, you can't believe this, because this is in the middle of it, right? It's not the first, it's not the last part of the story, but it's right smack dab in the middle. And however you want to flip it, that is necessary, because from those 6 people came all the rest of us after the fact. So yeah, hopefully I can find the second part to his little speech here and, you know, make another video on it. But regardless of the fact, that's why I believe in Moses's, and, you know, considering you're on this channel, I'd imagine you believe it too, or you don't believe it, in which case, let me know why in the comments. Anyway, see y'all next time. All right, that's going to be the end of the video. Hope you guys have yourself a fantastic rest of your day. Peace. You know what's crazy is this setup, I think, is the best setup I've had. And I literally go back to school tomorrow, so it's gonna be gone. And I think I recorded, what, 2 or 3 videos with this setup, man. It's tough, but whatever.